thanks so much for coming out. I'm super excited to talk about how effective communication drives team performance. This is something that we're really passionate about at Lingo Live. We are big believers in this. Our mission is to empower human beings to contribute their unique potential in the workplace. And we find that oftentimes what's holding them back the most is their ability to communicate with confidence, with clarity, and with authenticity. So the way that we've been solving that is matching these people with coaches, particularly English as a second language professionals, who struggle to contribute at the same pace that the conversation's moving. And I wanted to be able to, before we bring out the panel, because I know communication's a really broad topic, it's very abstract. So I wanted to be able to break it down into its core components to really define what do we mean when we say effective communication and why that drives team performance. But before we get started, I want to try a little show of hands. How many of you use project management software like Asana or Trello within your teams? Yeah, not surprisingly, pretty much everyone. And then what about KPI tracking tools or business intelligence tools like Looker, Sumo Logic, right? So this stuff is super important, but it lives at a very operational layer, right? So I would think of these tools as really operational alignment. So how do you set OKRs that make sense, that drive the mission and vision forward? How do you assign accountability using these tools? How do you track performance? Super, super important. But if you stop there, then the assumption is that this is how teams function, and this is how the work's going to get done. And that those operational layer tools are going to trickle down to teams and how they perform, when in actuality, teams function like this. So this is a study that was released by Deloitte recently talking about how the modern organization, how modern teams function. And by the way, a lot being put on managers. Like, okay, this is fundamentally about communication and interactions. Frontline managers, figure it out. There's a lot of guidance and tools provided to them, but this is a lot for them to manage, this complexity of interactions. So here's where we have seen over the past 7 years, working with some of the leading innovators in the world, and particularly with their product and engineering teams, this is how we're seeing the communication start to break down. So this operational layer is really just the tip of the iceberg. If we think about the other components that have to happen in the teams, the first and arguably most important is building trust. So how do you create a culture where people trust one another? If you want to build a highly dysfunctional team, get a bunch of people in the room together who don't trust one another. I'm sure you all have, unfortunately, experienced that in your careers. And the way that you do this is you create a culture of transparency, openness, honesty. You coach these folks on how to be aware of their wake, we say at Lingo Live. So be more perceptive of the way you're coming across when you get frustrated or when you share certain things that rub people the wrong way. If you can build that trust, then you can create the psychological safety and the space for people to share their perspectives openly. But again, their ability to do that is predicated on, can they articulate ideas concisely in whether that's a daily stand-up with teams or in a written format? Do they have the courage to speak up in meetings? Do they know how to give a presentation? Third, and probably most important, is to demand debate. So how do you have disagreements? If somebody shares a perspective that you don't think is right, how do you thoughtfully disagree with that perspective? How do you give feedback to somebody? How do you uncover the root causes of the problems that the team's having without status or ego getting in the way? So that finally, we're done talking. We've debated, we've shared perspectives, we need to commit. We need to make clear commitments, and we need to force clarity and closure across the teams so that then finally these tools that we have at the operational layer are going to be as effective as possible. So this is what we've learned working with English as a second language professionals. But over the past year, we've started to help product and engineering folks regardless of their native language proficiency, and particularly helping frontline managers gain these skills so that they can then coach people on their team for how to do this. And the way that we're doing that is connecting them with a live coach who's an expert in each one of these areas for one-on-one coaching online. So we're excited because we're actually launching that product today at Plato. And if y'all are interested in learning more about that, we've got a booth, and we'd love to chat with you more about it. But I think more importantly, we've got a great panel of folks who are going to address how these specific components have broken down on their teams and how they've figured out ways to overcome these issues. So without further ado, let me bring out first WeWork's VP of Technology, Jen Yu. Netflix VP of Global Product Innovation, Michael Spiegelman. Apartment List VP of Engineering, Sue Nallapeta. And finally, Eventbrite's SVP of Engineering, Pat Poels. Let's give a round of a hand for the panelists here. Awesome. Hey, Jen. How's it going?
Good.
I want to start with you, actually. So we talked about trust being the foundation, building the safe space within your teams for trust. Can you share a little bit more about what that looks like at WeWork?
I would say the first principle is really making the principles feel like they were originating from the team as opposed to a culture of communication top-down. So one of the things that I always make sure to do is spend some time off-site in a very intimate environment where the team can be honest about what they expect from each other. And then coming out of that, develop some expectations around how we communicate with one another, just so that we have something to hold each other accountable to. And then the second thing is really about giving folks a forum or some sort of channel to be more revealing or vulnerable about who they are and how they operate and communicate. And one way that I found this really useful is by building user manuals, which some people also call baseball cards. But it's essentially a brief summary of things about me, how to communicate with me, what are things that people tend to misperceive about me, which I find highly valuable, and things that make me happy in my role. And I find that kind of putting your weaknesses, blind spots, and nuances and quirks on paper kind of makes it easier to then interact and understand where the other person's coming from.
That's awesome. Thanks. What about you, Sue? I know you shared some interesting perspectives on that.
So when I started at Apartment List about 8-9 months ago, I walked into a situation where the long-term CTO who had been with the company had left a year ago, and then there was another VP of Engineering who stayed for a shorter time, left as well. So the team was left without a head of engineering for a few months. Also, there were pockets of teams that did not have managers. So there was a lot of uncertainty and lack of trust among the team itself on how to operate. So one thing that I found that has been useful in building trust with the team itself is one, basically three things. One is working the team and then the problem. So I started with actually understanding, just actively listening to the team to understand the context, history, why some decisions were made the way they were, and just taking it all in. And then really building a team camaraderie and instilling the right processes so the team can work together and feel like a team. A lot of people were working in a team, but they were working in silos. So that sort of helped out, and that also started creating a culture that that's very unique to each of the teams. Some teams have once every 2 weeks they just have drinks and tea and things like that. Some teams just wear animal T-shirts every Wednesday. So it started building that team culture and brought everybody together. The second thing was how can we move towards resolving relationship conflicts to focusing on task conflicts. So relationship conflicts more around emotional friction, just ego and disagreements, and it's very emotional, as opposed to task conflict. Let's disagree about decisions and let's talk it out and commit to it, as opposed to just focusing on emotions. So that helped out. And the last thing was building out a career ladder for the teams itself, and focusing on things like ownership and leadership and what kind of impact you can make, and things like how do you receive feedback, how do you provide feedback to each other, how do you trust and help each other out, mentor each other. That has also sort of built that trust over time.
That's awesome. Thanks for sharing. Did you want to share anything on that, Michael? I saw you turn your head quickly.
No, now I feel like I have to come up with something really smart. But I would just agree with that. A lot of the foundation of trust building and going through these exercises is important, and that notion of vulnerability, which I think is gaining a lot more currency in management, is really crucial. And I think I'm reading Brené Brown's Dare to Lead, which anyone read that? Show of hands, are reading it right now? like a couple. She talks about how these are perceived as like often soft skills, but the courage to actually admit when you don't know what you're doing, or when you're doing it wrong, or when you are bad at something takes a lot. And so I think those things really help break down a lot of barriers and create real human relationships between people.
Yeah, it's so fascinating, like learning the psychology behind that and why we are this way. It makes sense. That kind of fight or flight instinct is embedded in our DNA.
That's right.
What about the, moving to you, Pat, the concept, if we've now built a team where there's a strong sense of trust, what about your sharing perspectives? Oftentimes, product and engineering teams are working on pretty conceptual things that are difficult to articulate concisely. How have you helped your teams figure out a way to do that?
Yeah, well, when you're communicating, in any setting, it's really important to be thinking about what is it that you are trying to get across. What do you want to? What's the objective of the communication? And I think, like when you came up here today to be on stage, I'm sure you didn't just decide what you were going to say and not consider what's the audience and what do I want to have them get from this communication. And I do think that's one of the pieces of coaching you give to people is, really take a little bit of time to think about who are you talking with. And what do you hope to accomplish with the communication? What do you want them to get from this? What do you hope to get out of the conversation or communication? And you'll find that if you're talking to a very technical audience, you want to deliver the message one way. If you're talking with your CEO, it might be a different way. But I think that just taking the time up front to really understand and identify who am I talking with, what do I want to have come out of this conversation? What are my objectives? And then when you look at what you decided that you wanted to say, take a look at it and decide, do you think that this is actually going to get across what you want? Are you going to get the objectives that you want out of the communication?
Michael, I know you shared some perspective on this too when we chatted. Can you elaborate on this and what this looks like at Netflix?
Yeah, sure. So, we tackle a lot of, conceptually difficult or technically challenging projects. And I think, one of the previous panels, one of the questions was, are technical specs and requirements documents overrated or underrated? And I think the consensus was they're overrated, and it feels very sort of 10 years ago to have these really long documents. But that was an attempt to explain to someone everything you would need to know about this thing in order to be able to move it forward. And I think what we found works much better is exactly the opposite, which is really investing in everybody having a shared context of what are you trying to achieve, what's the consumer experience you want to create, what problem are you solving for people, what hypothesis do you have, and to have those debated out amongst the team so everyone really has a great understanding of it. And then as you go along, you want people to be able to function with a lot of autonomy and a lot of decision making to solve problems in a way that gets you best to that goal. And so there's no way anything that's large and complicated that you'll be able to anticipate all the things that will come up along the way. And the devil really is in the details. It's in all those small decisions you make that an engineer makes, a designer makes, that they make in working together in solving a problem. And you want them to be really conceptually aligned. And then when big things come along, to be able to debate and discuss them amongst the team and come to a pretty crisp decision about what the outcome is. But it's really that investment in the shared context that's so crucial. And that's part of that is the trust, is people trusting each other, trusting that they're going to function as a team, trusting that they're going to play their roles well, that a product manager is going to make good decisions that are in the best interest of the product and the customer, that engineers are going to make great technical decisions, that designers are going to really be great user advocates. And if people are kind of playing those roles and playing them out well, you'll have trust that that they'll do their jobs well and you can rely on them to get to this ultimate outcome. So it's really about a lot of that shared context that's most crucial.
But then what happens, right? I know Netflix has a big culture on feedback. What happens if what you share somebody disagrees with? What does that look like? How do you do that?
Yeah, so how many people here, has anyone here read Netflix's culture document or any iteration of it? All right, cool. So we're very big on feedback, very big on candid feedback. And it does rest first and foremost on a layer of trust, is that if I believe that you're giving me the feedback because you want me to be more successful and want me to be more effective, I'll be that much more open to it. So if you tell me, I think that you're doing a crappy job of of being fast at making decisions, you're taking too long, et cetera, if I think that you're just trying to, make me feel terrible or show me up in front of people, I'm not going to respond well. But if I think that you're invested in me being the best product leader possible, it's that's great. You can see that that's something that's going on, and let's have an honest conversation about why that is. And it can get down into those reasons of why it's happening and help someone really unblock it. I think that the other thing is, we tend to use this model that there are two people involved in every feedback discussion, and there's a kind of shared reality between them. So I know what's going on in my head and what I'm intending. You know what's going on, what you perceive. And there's this kind of interaction between the two. And you can't make assumptions on what the other person's intentions are or what their feelings are. So if I start attributing things to you, it doesn't go very well, because then people get defensive and they say, no, that's not at all. You don't get me at all. That's totally wrong. Yeah. But if you keep it to here's how I perceive what you're doing and here's the effect it has on me and the team, then you can have an objective conversation around this is something you perceive, and then I need to do something differently or communicate differently or adjust differently or change how I approach a problem. And that becomes a lot more of an easier conversation for people to have.
Yeah, that's so huge, that vulnerability of saying, look, this is the perception. This is not reality. This is not a fact. I'm stating this is what I'm perceiving.
That's right.
What about for you, Jen? You mentioned the user manuals. Does this help people to have those conversations?
Yeah, I think so. Especially in a work context when it seems like a project has not been very successful. One thing that I find really helpful is really articulating what the hypothesis was when you originally set out to be successful. And so identifying whether it was part of the process or the people, the planning, what things could have been avoided, and being very objective as opposed to really focusing on people and their own capabilities, that tends to set a good context for feedback.
Great.
Yeah,
Anyone else want to add to this?
No, I think it's very important to provide feedback in the moment. So when I see issues happening, I usually don't wait until a one-on-one to provide feedback. I just immediately reach out to the person to provide feedback. And that actually is better because then you can talk about it in detail when you actually have more time. And it also gives a person a chance to reflect. And even I have been in situations where people have provided me feedback and I have gotten defensive. And the way I try to mitigate that is now I ask clarifying questions. I basically reiterate what the person is telling me just to give me some time to think through that process. And then sort of respond back saying, okay, that's a fair feedback. Here is why I acted the way I did, and I'm sorry for that, and this is how I will move forward. So that actually helps build a lot of trust with the team, and you actually provide in-the-moment feedback.
But it's such a hard thing. Like, as a leader, you can do it, and you've learned how to do this, but if you have managers, what's the biggest objection you get when you tell them you need to give feedback in the moment, and then...
It's not about in the moment. In general, when you're a first-line manager, it's very scary to provide feedback. It's because you overthink how you come across. And then it always, like, you also have this great relationship with your team member, and you don't want to lose that relationship, so you sort of feel like you have that fear and that worry that if I provide this feedback, how is that going to work? But that's core part of your job. And if it's scary, like one of the things I did, which I'm sure, like, it's a horrible thing to do, is to video yourself and listen to yourself, just how you come across when you provide feedback. I would recommend doing it once, but not again. But it actually helps figure out how you come across. A lot of times you don't come across as harsh as you think, and it'll help you actually craft the message well enough that the feedback is received.
Yeah. I know Sam, the co-founder at Box, talked about this last year, actually. He was talking about how perception is everything. You know, it doesn't really matter what you're intending to do or what you mean. It matters how the other person sees it. So that's an interesting way to dig into that. Pat, anything you want?
Well, I think, yeah, one of the things you led with was talking about how important it was to develop trust. And you know, when you're having this moment where you want to give someone feedback and you're not sure how they're going to perceive the feedback, if they're going to take it defensively or whatever, I find that like the moment is not the right place for you to build this trust. But earlier, if you are willing to just take the little step of asking for feedback, like pretty often from other people, I think what that does is it opens up this channel of, okay, I've heard Pat ask for feedback, I've been able to give him feedback, and he takes it very well. And now, when it's time in the moment for me to give feedback to someone else, I find that they're pretty receptive to it because they've already had plenty of opportunities to give it to me. So it's like a kind of a preparation bridge that you can build, over time by just doing a simple thing of asking for feedback.
Yeah.
Yeah, can I actually add one thing? There's a lot of literature on what makes feedback most effective, and timeliness is like one thing that consistently comes up in literature, but the other thing is also being super specific. And the format that's often suggested is, when you did X, I felt Y. And this is one way of staying on your side of the net, because all you know is your assumptions to what you said.
Right. So I mentioned we've as we're kind of moving up that pyramid, we've built trust. We're sharing our perspectives in a way that's concise and interesting. We're disagreeing in a way that's vulnerable and that's honest, but we've got to make commitments. We've actually got to disagree and commit and move forward on what it is that we're doing. So Sue, I'd love for you to share a little bit about what that looks like.
Yeah, I think, as I said, it's very important the team to understand and be like functioning towards a common goal. And I think so we actually have cross-functional teams. We have a full stack team that has OKRs for each of the teams. I think that really helps because they're all fully aligned with the goals and they sort of know what's important to the company and how their team can align to the bigger goal and vision. But then when you have disagreements or even if you have a difference of opinion about a strategy, like having that forum of actually coming up with OKRs every quarter helps bring those things to light. And I think managers should actually encourage teams to bring feedback. And I think Jen sort of mentioned this, having offsites and actually aligning with the team up front helps as well. Like make the team part of the process, make it their idea, make it like have them come up with some of these decisions. People get better over time by making decisions and be there to support them. It's okay, like if they succeed, it's their win, but if they fail, like instilling that trust that I am there, I will help support you through this transition actually helps, even if you disagree and then like you can commit to it.
But I'm curious, where we've seen this be the biggest challenge with companies, and actually even in our own company, is before the OKRs are set, you're actually trying to figure out what the team level OKRs are, and you need to have conversation, and oftentimes you can get stuck in like the brainstorming phase, and people are vibing off one another, they're disagreeing maybe a little bit, but eventually you've got to stop, and you've got to commit to goals.
I think one of the biggest things I have seen teams failing is if you try to make it a very consensus-driven decision. You have to have one person who's a decision maker, and you can pick that person up front, or you can say, I'm going to be the decision maker at the end of it. I'll get everybody's perspectives. So I think if you try to bring alignment across everyone and get everyone to agree, it's not going to happen.
Right.
But you just have to ultimately like say, okay, I'm going to make a decision, and here is why, and let's all align to this.
Sure.
Yeah, there's actually one tactic that I learned that I found really helpful because we spend so much time spinning around decisions that don't get made or maybe don't matter at the end of the day. And so before a really big decision, I ask around the room, like, how important is this outcome to you? And to make it a little bit more democratic, what we do is on the count of 3, 1, 2, 3, raise as many fingers as you really care about this decision. So if you don't really care and you're a 1 and you actually don't have a lot of input, like you might not actually be needed in that conversation.
Oh, wow.
It narrows the kitchen down to like the people who really care about the outcome to discuss and debate then why they care so much about it.
That's super interesting. I hadn't heard that model. What about, you mentioned the informed captain model. Michael, I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, so for us, this is sort of the model we put in place in order to make sure we pivot from brainstorming to decision making. And I think early on, when you're trying to source ideas, you want as many people involved as possible. But it can't just be consensus in how you move forward. Like there are some people who have to have the responsibility of determining where a team goes and making certain decisions. So we generally try and clarify the role of the informed captain beforehand. And that person's job is to solicit opinions and perspectives, but also make and own the decision. And so if it's the product leader, their realm of responsibility is this. They're informed captain for the strategy, the hypothesis, the ultimate customer problem we're trying to solve. For the engineering leader, they're the informed captain for making a lot of technical decisions and architecture decisions and things like that. And so each person has these kind of roles, and we try and use that all the way up to the organization. If there's different teams involved, you don't want it to be a situation where 3 people all have to come to agreement to move the company and the organization forward. Someone has to be the informed captain in each place. And if it's unclear, we'll designate who that person is. And it's that person's job to own the decision. And then it's everyone's job to kind of move forward according to that. There's no, kind of sniping from the sidelines or backbiting or whatever it is. It's like, you're going to be the informed captain for some things, someone else is going to be the informed captain for the others, but they have to be invested in that responsibility. And, I think it's like, you always find that the worst thing is no decision. And if we make one and it's the wrong one, we'll figure it out and we'll rule it out and we'll do something different. And it's not, most things are not a commitment at the end of time. Right. And so recognizing that and take the gravity out of it and saying, but here's the person who has to make the call, and they're going to own it, and we're all going to respect that. That's been crucial for us in keeping decision-making power really relevant as we grow.
Awesome. Pat, anything you want to add?
Sure. I mean, so on decision making, I mean, I'll make it personal for a second. I played poker for a living for 5 years, and during that time, I had to make, hundreds to thousands of decisions a day. And what I learned was my whole job was to get better and better at making decisions. So spend a lot of time understanding that you're not going to make them all correctly, but a lot of time looking backwards at what the decisions were, because I know that every day I'm going to have to keep making a ton of these things. So just keep on improving at making decisions. And so what that helps me with now, sure, it helps me with not being afraid of making them, but the thing I can bring to the team is I don't make all the decisions, but what I can help them understand is we have to continually get better at making a decision. So always we need to be looking backwards at what we decided to do, what was the outcome, what did we learn from it, because we're going to keep on making them day after day after day. So just keep on tuning, getting better and better as a team at making decisions.
So then that creates that culture of decision making, like, oh yeah, we have done these postmortems before, nobody died, we need to continue to move forward. So we have time for one question from Slido, actually, from the audience. I am not in control of the Slido, but if somebody can share with us what that looks like. Okay. So these are comments coming from people. I'm curious if we want to take one question maybe from the audience, if you want to chime in on Slido. We've got about 3 minutes left, and we'd love to answer your biggest question about how communication drives performance at the team level that maybe you feel like hasn't been addressed, or something that was addressed that you'd love some more color on.
Can I make one comment about decision making
Yeah.
while we wait for
Yeah.
the cycle through? I think when one of the previous speakers was talking about Ray Dalio's principles and some of the things that he articulated, I thought there's a lot of really wild stuff, but one of the interesting things that he said in making decisions about what companies and things to invest in is he would write down the reason for that and what he was thinking, and then going back and learning from what you were thinking when you're making each decision. Because often, you have a certain amount of information at the time, and it can be very easy to say, oh, knowing what I know now, I would have made a different decision. But it's like knowing what you know then, would you still made that decision? And what can you learn from how you viewed things or how you framed things that will help you to make a better decision as you go along? Because I agree, getting good at decision making is really crucial.
Yeah, and also to that point, I think it's really important to frame mistakes as simply bets. Because just because an outcome wasn't what you had thought it might be doesn't actually mean that your process was wrong. At the end of the day, the odds can be stacked against you or for it. And so part of the process is understanding what the probabilities are and making a good decision.
Yeah. So this is actually related to this. What do you do when you empower someone to make a choice and you massively disagree with the choice they made?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's part of the process. Like, you have to trust people to fail and learn from the failure. It's very intuitive for leaders and executives to step in and like solve the problem or correct course in the middle of people making the decision, but you just have to be patient and let them go through it, and otherwise they will not learn. And also find ways when you actually empower someone as well, like how critical it is to the business and at what point the company is in. Companies go through different growth phases, and there's a time when you're building a lot of new things. There's a time when you're just optimizing for existing things, and then figuring out like when you need to empower what decisions to whom is key.
Awesome.
I agree somewhat, I don't agree somewhat. So I would say, like, I would want to think about what do I think is the outcome, what's going to happen from this decision. I would equate it to, if you're walking with someone and you see that they're going to trip and maybe they might skin their knee, you may not have to jump in and do anything about that. But if someone's going to walk in front of a bus and you know they're going to walk in front of a bus, then I think you owe it to them to push them out of the way. So it really kind of depends on what is the outcome going to be to the business. If it's something you don't agree with, but kind of as you were talking about the number system, like if this is going to be a 2 out of 10 on what kind of damage it might cause, you need to go with the fact that you empowered someone to make it. If it's going to be something that is a bet the business decision and it's clearly wrong, I think you have to jump in and say something about that.
There's also the idea of two-way door decisions and one-way door decisions that I feel like is really powerful.
Yeah.
Being run over by a bus, you can't be unrun by the bus.
Yeah.
Tripping, you can, you'll be fine. And so it's how important and impactful is it to the business, and also is it irreversible.
Right.
Yeah, and I think being really selective at what those times are that you want to overrule a decision and trying to do it as seldom as possible,
Exactly.
and more try and focus on how do you help that person think about things, understand the gravity or relative gravity of a situation, or understand what different things that you see that they may not be seeing, or help them get feedback from other people that might improve their decision making. Because like once you take empowerment away, it's hard to give it back, and so you want that team to be invested in how they learn to be better at decision making too.
This is awesome. Thank you all so much. Super fascinating topic. Can we get a round of applause for the panel here?